Welcome to the Daily Bite. I'm your host, Pastor Steve Andrews. Today we start the study of a new book together. We're going to be in Esther for the next week and a half. So Esther chapter 1 is our text together. But before we dig into that, let's take an overview of the whole book. The book of Esther is written somewhere there in the 400s BC. There's no specific date given to it, as it's going to look back on the reign of King Ahasuerus. We'll talk about him in just a moment. So it's the last in the history books of the Old Testament. So everything really from the book of Genesis through Esther is going to be that section on history. A lot of people might take Genesis through Deuteronomy and separate them out as a separate category as the Torah, the Pentateuch, and that's okay. But, Genesis starts the history recording, right? And it goes all the way through really a solid chunk of the history of this creation. But regardless, you're going to come down here and eventually have 1st and 2nd Samuel that goes through the period of Saul and David. Then you're going to get 1st and 2nd Kings, and you're going to get 1st and 2nd Chronicles that take you through the majority of those kings. And then you get to, finally, Ezra and Nehemiah, the release of Israel and Judah from captivity in Babylon, the rebuilding of Jerusalem, the rebuilding of the temple. And then lastly, we get to Esther. Esther chronologically comes at the end of them all, because Ezra and Nehemiah, the rebuilding of Jerusalem, the rebuilding of the temple, that's going to happen with Cyrus' command at the start there in 538 BC. They don't get everything done until, they don't get the temple rebuilt until 517. And then it's going to be really another generation still before they even continue more. And that's going to be Nehemiah's work of rebuilding the city walls. And so what we have here with Esther is going to come after that. If you're trying to look at the order of the kings, you have King Cyrus, who is also sometimes called Darius the Mede in the Old Testament, the book of Daniel, for example. Cambyses comes second, then Darius the First, Xerxes, Artaxerxes, and then Darius II. Those are the 6 Persian kings that you'll see mentioned. And Xerxes is Ahasuerus that is mentioned here at the start of our text today. One of the things that people notice about the book of Esther is that God is never mentioned in the book, which seems really odd for something to be in Scripture. For that reason, there have been many who have thought it didn't have a place in God's Word, that this is a book that should have been dropped. The flip to that, the other side of that conversation, is the idea that this lets you see how God is working behind the scenes. We're going to see a plot to wipe out God's people, and yet it doesn't work. It fails. And how does it fail? Well, God is going to work through even earthly government here in this case to protect and provide for his people. This young Jewish woman, who the book is named after, right, Esther, is going to be a part of how the Lord carries out this plan of his. And so he's going to work. And this is Romans 8, right, that the Lord works all things for the good of his people, those that he has called, those he has elected. And so we see that here. That is a theme in Ezra and Nehemiah as well. They have a little bit of that going on, the idea of God working behind the scenes on behalf of his people. So that's kind of the perspective that we'll take it from as we study this one together. Let's go ahead and dig into the text itself with chapter 1 today. Now, in the days of Ahasuerus, the Ahasuerus who reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces, in those days when King Ahasuerus sat on his royal throne in Susa the citadel, in the 3rd year of his reign, he gave a feast for all his officials and servants. The army of Persia and Media, and the nobles and governors of the provinces were before him, while he showed the riches of his royal glory and the splendor and pomp of his greatness for many days, 180 days. And when these days were completed, the king gave for all the people present in Susa the citadel, both great and small, a feast lasting for 7 days, in the court of the garden of the king's palace. There were white cotton curtains and violet hangings, fastened with cords of fine linen, and purple to silver rods and marble pillars, and also couches of gold and silver, on a mosaic pavement of porphyry, marble, mother of pearl, and precious stones. Drinks were served in golden vessels, vessels of different kinds, and the royal wine was lavished according to the bounty of the king. And drinking was according to this edict. There is no compulsion. For the king had given orders to all the staff of his palace to do as each man desired. Queen Vashti also gave a feast for the women in the palace that belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehuman, Biztha, Harbona, Bigtha, and Abagtha, Zethar, and Carcas, the 7 eunuchs who served in the presence of King Ahasuerus, to bring Queen Vashti before the king with her royal crown, in order to show the peoples and the princes her beauty, for she was lovely to look at. But Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's command, delivered by the eunuchs. At this the king became enraged, and his anger burned within him. Then the king said to the wise men who knew the times, for this was the king's procedure toward all who were versed in law and judgment, the men next to him being Karshina, Shethar, Admatha, Tarshish, Meres, Marsena, and Memucan, the 7 princes of Persia and Media who saw the king's face, and sat first in the kingdom, according to the law, what is to be done to Queen Vashti, because she has not performed the command of King Ahasuerus delivered by the eunuchs. Then Memucan said in the presence of the king and the officials, "Not only against the king has Queen Vashti done wrong, but also against all the officials and all the peoples who are in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus. For the queen's behavior will be made known to all women, causing them to look at their husbands with contempt, since they will say, 'King Ahasuerus commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him. She did not come.' This very day the noble women of Persia and Media who have heard of the queen's behavior will say the same to all the king's officials, and there will be contempt and wrath in plenty. If it please the king, let a royal order go out from him, and let it be written among the laws of the Persians and the Medes, so that it may not be repealed, that Vashti is never again to come before King Ahasuerus, and let the king give her royal position to another who is better than she. So when the decree made by the king is proclaimed throughout all his kingdom, for it is vast, all women will give honor to their husbands, high and low alike." This advice pleased the king and the princes, and the king did as Memucan proposed. He sent letters to all the royal provinces, to every province in its own script, and to every people in its own language, that every man be master in his own household, and speak according to the language of his people. This is the word of the Lord. So in the days of King Ahasuerus, verse 1, that would be the reign of Xerxes, Xerxes, and that's going to go from 486 until 465 BC. So that's our time stamp here on the book, at least the events of the book. Ahasuerus that reigned from India to Ethiopia over 127 provinces. What an empire, right? I mean, take a look at a map and see how far that stretches. A lot of people can find India and really Ethiopia, Africa on their maps, right? This is stretching over continents here. He sits on the royal throne in Susa. Susa is 200 miles to the northeast of Babylon. It was really the winter home for Persian kings. It's the 3rd year of his reign. That puts us in 484 BC, roughly. And he gives a feast for everyone. Right? I mean, look at this. You've got the officials and the servants feasting alike. You've got the army, the nobles, the governors, everyone before him. And he uses this time to brag. I mean, right? He shows off the riches of his glory. He shows off the splendor, the pomp. He shows off his greatness. It's a brag fest for 180 days. It's hard to even imagine a celebration that lasts that long, right? And that's what they have here under the reign of Xerxes. At the end of the 180 days, the king then decides to give a 7-day feast for all present. So that takes you actually over the half a year now at this point. And so he throws this feast, and the description of the palace is luxurious, and everything's expensive. I mean, these are all the richest, finest things. So the idea of violet, purple, those colors are expensive dyes to come by. You've got silver rods, marble pillars, couches of gold. I mean, does anybody have a couch? Does anyone need a couch of gold? I mean, really? No. You've got even the drinking vessels that they're using are made of gold, right? And the king lavishes his wine upon his people. So richly, abundantly gives out this wine to others. And he tells them to drink with no compulsion. So there is no compulsion. That law really, that statement by the king works in both directions. For those who would rather not drink much wine, they are not being required to. Apparently the custom was whenever the king would raise his glass, everyone else was to raise their glass, and they couldn't raise their glass except for when the king did. So this essentially wipes it out in both ways. You're not forced to drink every time the king drinks, but you're also free to drink as much as you want. He gives orders, every man to do as he desires. We also learn in verse 9 that Queen Vashti gives a feast for all the women in the palace as well, so a separate feast. Then the trouble comes in the next paragraph. We see that on the 7th day, so the end of the feast, right, everything is coming to its close, Xerxes sends his 7 eunuchs to summon Queen Vashti to come into his presence that he may show her off to his kingdom, right? Bragging once again. Hey, you've seen everything else. I've saved the best for last. Here's my bride. Here's my queen. And we're told of her beauty, which she was lovely to look at, but she refuses to come. And he's enraged by this. Several things to kind of unpack there, and maybe multiple questions you can even have as a family on that. Why wouldn't she come? It's a chance for her beauty to be put on display in front of the entire land. The whole princess dream that many young girls have today, that fantasy almost, she has a chance for the entire world in that moment to look at her and wish to be her. That's what her husband's been up to for the last 187 days. Anyway, the flip side to that, why is this a problem that she refuses? Why does this make the king so angry? One thing to keep in mind about the culture that we're actually going to learn from later on in the book is that you don't get to come into the king's presence, not even the queen. You don't get to come into the king's presence without his permission, without him extending that invitation. So we'll see that later from Esther, that she can't come without the king granting it. It's a different world, certainly, than the world that we live in. It's weird to think of that in a relationship in a household between a husband and his wife, right? But that's the way it was for King Ahasuerus, Xerxes, and his wife, Queen Vashti. We don't know much of anything about their relationship, to be honest, but this shows you that it's strained, right? At least for whatever reason, Vashti refuses. She refuses the king's command. And so he turns to his wise men who know the times, right? They're versed in law and judgment. He's used to turning to these 7 princes who regularly sit in his presence. What does the law say should be done? Now, Ahasuerus seems to only be looking at this from his own perspective, right? And one of these men is going to stand up and say, there's a bigger picture to consider. We'll come back to Memicon here in just a moment. But first, Xerxes wants to know what should happen to Vashti. She has disobeyed the king. That's a fair question, right? A king is ruler over his entire people. He's given someone a command in his kingdom, and that command has been rejected. That is a breaking of the law. So what should come of that? That's his question. Memicon points out it's not just the king that Queen Vashti has wronged. She's wronged everyone in this. Because this is not, Xerxes on a random night of the week when things are pretty low-key in the capital. asking Vashti to come to him, right? This is the command given in front of the entirety of the provinces, their governors, their nobles, the officials, the army, the servants. Everyone is there. And Vashti refused in front of all of them. This is setting an example for the rest of the kingdom to see and behold and imitate, right? You can think of this even just today, how much people want to follow in the lives of celebrities. We want to know all about what they're doing. Their fashion trends become the things that people do, right? They become trends. That's what the idea trending is all about. We want to be in their lives, and we want to mimic them. We want to imitate them. And Memucan is recognizing that all of the kingdom is going to try to mimic. They're going to try to match what Vashti did. So he gives the advice to the king that Vashti should be removed from that position, and that someone who is better than she should be given the position. That's going to be talked about tomorrow in chapter 2. But that in doing so, and he flatters him, right, your kingdom is vast, that all women in the kingdom would honor their husbands. So here's been a public display of dishonor. So put her aside, put her away, and let's show the kingdom what it's supposed to be like. And so the law is proposed, it's made, it's sent out to every province in its own script. I mean, wide kingdom, right? Egyptian hieroglyphs, Persian cuneiform, Hebrew alphabet, maybe the Greek alphabet, to every people in its own language, that every man be master in his own household and speak according to the language of his people. Now, as we're wrapping up today's text, that final line, those things are not actually what Memucan said, so at least not that we have recorded. So is the king and the other princes building on what Memucan said, or did Memucan actually say more that just wasn't recorded? We can't say. But we do know what ended up being put into law. Basically, the last part, speaking in their own language, if you have, for example, a mixed marriage where a husband and wife have multiple languages in the household, the husband, as the head of the household, is the master of the household. His language takes primary focus. That's the language of the household. The law, then, that every man be master in his own household. That has been the way that almost every culture in the course of history has worked. The idea of how we live in the United States today is very foreign to history, but it's also, I'm going to say our pattern is also foreign to Scripture at the same time. This is an opportunity to take Genesis 1 through 3 into consideration, both God's design and also the fall and the curse. The design of God was to create Adam, and that Adam was not good for Adam to be alone, so God was going to make him a helper. It's Adam's job to care for creation, to have dominion over everything, and then he receives a helper from the Lord, a gift, a helper according to his opposite, right? And that's Eve, as we know. She's his helper. She is to help him fulfill what God has given him to do, which again, care for creation, have dominion over it. So she aids him in doing so. It is in the fall into sin in Genesis 3, in the curse, that we then see part of the woman's curse is that she is going to desire her husband. That is not the physical sexual attraction kind of desire, but rather that desire for her husband is for his role. And that's what you see in Genesis 4. Look for that desire word again in Genesis 4, and you'll see that sin desires to master over Cain. Sin desires Cain, but Cain must learn to master over sin instead. Intentional word parallel right there. So Genesis 3 then is teaching us the actual curse of Eve. Well, part of the curse of Eve is that she's going to long to have the head of the household role of her husband. She's going to try to take it from him. And in response, the husband is going to rule over his wife. So rather than a loving dominion, a care for his wife, the husband is going to rule over her in a harsher way because he's pushing back against her longing for his position. So he's not going to rule over her as generously, genuinely, self-sacrificially, as he ought to have. And so we're going to see that in the New Testament, in Paul's letters to the church, for example. The husband is the head of his wife, as Christ is the head of the church. Ephesians 5 uses that language. And that the husband, as Jesus did, right? Jesus did not come to lead us by making us all serve him. Jesus came to lead by serving us, right? And so the husband learns the same thing. The husband is the head of his household in the Christian faith. It's the way God designed it to be. But that role of leading is done by service. And Ephesians 5, starting at verse 22 to 33, is a great section on this. But for the husband, starting at verse 25, learning that Christ gave himself up for his bride, the church. And that's what husbands are to do for their wives. Difficult text. A lot of people don't like that text, but this is how the scriptures speak of marriage. So we see King Xerxes laying down this law that on the one hand is very much so created order law here, and in that way good, but at the other side you can see the side of the curse in that this is now going to be enforced as a law in his kingdom. So we'll see what happens in chapter 2 with Vashti's replacement as queen.